Elena stood in the dim armory, her fingers brushing over the cold metal of her late husband's rifle. She had never thought she would hold it again. A weight both familiar and foreign settled over her shoulders. The echoes of the past whispered in, the silence, and she felt a chill run down her spine. The walls of the base seemed to close in around her, the fluorescent lights flickering above, casting shadows that danced like ghosts across the floor. She had walked these halls 1,000 times. Yet tonight everything felt different. Every step made her heart pound in her chest, louder than the distant hum of the generators outside. She could hear faint footsteps in the corridor beyond her vision, and she knew she was not alone. Her mind raced with memories of laughter, of shouting commands, of quiet nights spent planning missions with her husband by her side. But those memories were now tinged with a sharp edge, a loss that refused to fade, and a danger she could feel before she could see. The rifle in her hands felt heavier than she remembered, its polished stock smooth against her palm, yet every scratch and dent told a story of battles survived and missions completed. It was more than a weapon. It was a history. It was a promise. It was a connection to the man she had loved and the life that had been stolen from her. She ran her thumb along the trigger and imagined the familiar recoil, imagining herself back in the desert heat, imagining the sound of sand under boots, and the crack of gunfire cutting through the quiet dawn. But now the silence was absolute. A silence that pressed against her ears, making her senses sharper, making her notice the smallest details, the distant whisper of wind across the runway, the faint vibrations of vehicles idling beyond the gates, the soft creak of a door opening somewhere down the hall. Her breath came in shallow rhythms. She could feel it echoing in her chest like a drumbeat urging her to move, to act, to not wait for fate, to decide for her. She scanned the room once more, her eyes catching the glint of metal racks, the shadows of helmets lined in neat rows, and the faint shimmer of bullet casings left forgotten in corners of drawers. She could almost hear her husband's voice telling her to stay calm, to trust her instincts, to never let fear take control. But the memory made the ache in her chest sharper, and a single thought looped endlessly in her mind. What if she was too late? What if the threat had already arrived? Base felt alive now, as if it had a heartbeat of its own, pulsing through the walls and the floors and the lights above. She could feel it in the soles of her boots, in the tension coiled tight in her muscles, in the sweat prickling her skin, despite the chill around her. She moved slowly toward the door to the armory, her rifle cradled against her shoulder like an extension of her own body. Each step measured, each breath calculated. She felt the weight of unseen eyes on her, and a ripple of fear, mixed with adrenaline, surged through her veins. She stopped at the threshold, listening for any sound. Any hint of what lay beyond her fingers tightened around the trigger, and she pressed herself against the wall, ready to move at the first sign of movement. Outside the armory, the corridor stretched, long and dimly lit shadows pooling in corners like dark water. Hiding secrets, she pressed herself against the cold metal wall, feeling it bite into her skin, and waited, listening to the soft hum of the base around her. She could hear faint voices in the distance, the low murmur of guards patrolling the perimeter, the clatter of boots against metal walkways. But something was wrong. The rhythm of life in the base felt off, like a song played a half-beat too fast. She stepped forward inch by inch, her boots making no sound on the floor. Yet every nerve in her body screamed that she was being watched, that someone or something had already crossed the boundary of safety that she had imagined. She was alone, but the shadows told another story. Her eyes darted to the security monitors lining the walls, small screens glowing faintly in the darkness, showing empty corridors and silent gates. Yet she knew technology could not always reveal the truth. She thought of her husband, and the countless missions where a second could mean life or death, where danger was never announced, and the enemy moved like smoke through the air, invisible until it was too late. The memory tightened her chest and sharpened her senses. She moved faster now, slipping past corners, listening to the soft hiss of doors opening, listening to the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. She felt a presence behind her, a whisper of movement that was almost imperceptible, but enough to make her spin around, ready to face whatever was there, only to find the hallway empty. But the feeling lingered, and she knew that the emptiness itself could be a trap. The base seemed to stretch endlessly now as she moved deeper into its heart, the walls narrowing, the ceilings lower, the shadows darker. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, the rhythmic pounding, a reminder that she was alive and that she had a choice to act or to falter. She paused at the junction of two corridors, a single flickering light above, casting a weak glow across the floor. She glanced at the monitors again. A flicker on one screen caught her attention, a shadow moving against the pattern of normal activity. She froze, her finger brushing, the trigger instinct overriding fear. She moved closer to the screen, trying to focus, trying to understand the anomaly, but it vanished like smoke, leaving only the static of the monitor and the heavy silence that followed. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to call for backup, to let the soldiers handle the threat. But another part of her refused to wait. She had lived too long in the shadow of fear. She had faced too many missions where hesitation meant death. She pressed on, moving past doors and stairwells, moving through the labyrinth of the base. Each corner turned, revealing emptiness, and yet the feeling of being watched never faded. She could hear the soft creak of metal above her, the whisper of air vents shifting, the faint hum of power running through the walls, each sound amplified in her mind. Her pulse raced, and she could feel her breath catching as she imagined what could be waiting for her just beyond sight, a presence waiting to test her courage and to force her to confront the unknown. She reached the observation deck overlooking the outer perimeter, the wind from the desert outside biting through the open windows, carrying sand that stung her face. She raised the rifle and scanned the horizon. The sun had not yet risen, and the shadows of dunes stretched like fingers across the landscape. She squinted, trying to make out shapes against the faint light. A movement caught her eye, a ripple across the sand, something unnatural and deliberate, a pattern that was wrong. She felt the tension tighten in her shoulders, a cold sweat running down her back. She could feel the hairs on her arms standing as if warning her of the storm that had arrived silently and without notice. She pressed the scope against her eye, focusing on the shapes, trying to discern friend from foe. The sand shifted again, and she knew with a clarity that froze her in place that someone or something was coming, and there was no time to hesitate. Elena kept her eyes trained on the shifting sand below her. The desert seemed endless and unforgiving, yet she could sense the figures moving just beyond the horizon. Her grip on the rifle tightened as the wind whipped against her face, carrying the scent of dust and metal. She could hear the faint hum of machinery in the distance, the subtle vibrations under her boots, signaling something larger than she had imagined was approaching. The young soldiers below moved hesitantly along the perimeter, unaware of the danger closing in, and the radios crackled faintly with messages she could barely decipher. But the urgency was there, and she knew waiting for orders was no longer an option. A shadow detached itself from the dunes, and Elena tensed, every muscle coiled, ready to react. She adjusted her stance. The rifle pressed firmly against her shoulder, and her eyes tracked the figure. A man moving with deliberate steps, he carried no weapon, yet the way he moved suggested training and intent. Her mind raced through possibilities, friend or foe, ally or assassin, every scenario flashing through her memory of past missions. She could feel the familiar adrenaline surge, pushing her senses to the edge. The sun was rising, slowly painting the sand in hues of orange and red. Yet the beauty was deceptive, hiding danger beneath its glow. She could feel the presence of more figures shifting just beyond what her eyes could see, and a cold certainty settled in her chest that she was not facing a lone threat. The alarms finally blared, echoing across the base, but it was too late to alert everyone in time. The young soldiers scrambled in confusion, some fumbling with weapons, some ducking for cover, and Elena moved faster than she thought she could, her feet barely touching the ground as she sprinted toward the perimeter, the rifle steady in her hands. Every movement calculated and instinctive. She could hear shouts in the distance, commands mixing with panic, and her own heartbeat drowning out everything else. She reached the edge of the base and crouched behind a supply crate, her eyes scanning the approaching figures, trying to determine their numbers and their intent. She noticed patterns in their movements, a subtle coordination that told her this was no random attack. These were professionals trained to exploit every weakness, and she could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders, knowing that if she faltered, lives would be lost. The shadow of her husband hovered in her mind, reminding her to stay calm, to trust her instincts, to act without hesitation. She inhaled deeply, the air thick with sand and tension, and raised the rifle to her shoulder, the scope aligning perfectly with the lead figure. She could see the glint of metal on his belt, a weapon hidden but ready. She held her breath, waiting for the perfect moment to act. Then a sudden movement to her left made her pivot just in time to see another figure attempting to flank. The base. The soldier was fast, but not fast enough. Elena squeezed the trigger, and the shot rang out, cutting through the morning air. The figure dropped, but she had no time to celebrate or pause. The wind shifted and carried the sound to the others, alerting them that someone was ready and waiting. The base erupted in controlled chaos, soldiers rushing to positions, shouting into radios, and the ground vibrating under the sudden flurry of footsteps. She moved with them, slipping from shadow to shadow, taking advantage of the confusion to reposition herself to cover vulnerable angles. She could see the young soldiers looking at her with wide eyes, a mix of awe and disbelief at the calm decisiveness with which she moved. A third figure emerged from the dunes, this one larger, carrying something over his shoulder. Elena froze momentarily, trying to understand what it was, then realized it was a bundle of equipment, likely meant to breach the gates or disable the base perimeter. Her mind raced. She had seconds to act, and she adjusted her stance, raising the rifle, quickly aiming for the center of mass. The trigger responded instinctively, and the figure faltered, stumbling and dropping the equipment before disappearing into the dunes. She exhaled sharply, trying to steady her racing pulse, but there was no time to relax. More movement caught her eye further down the perimeter, a group working in coordination. Moving quickly and silently, Elena signaled to the nearest soldier to cover the flank, and he froze, staring at her for a moment before realizing the urgency and moving into position. The tension was palpable, every second stretching like hours. She advanced along the edge of the base, keeping low, her senses heightened, the rifle in her hands feeling almost like a part of her body, every shadow a potential threat, every whisper of movement a possible ambush. The sand kicked up around her boots, masking some of her movements, but not all, and she could feel the eyes of the enemy tracking her presence. She spotted another figure trying to slip through the gates, and without thinking, she fired a precise shot, taking the figure down before they could reach the barricade. The young soldiers began to coordinate their movements, inspired by her example, and she could see their confidence grow even as the threat multiplied. Suddenly, the wind carried a new sound, the faint but distinct hum of a drone approaching fast. Her eyes snapped to the sky, and she realized the situation was escalating beyond her initial assessment. Multiple drones were now in the air, scanning the base for targets. Her heart raced, adrenaline surging through her veins, but she forced herself to stay calm, analyzing the situation, trying to predict their patterns. She repositioned, quickly finding cover behind a metal container, and adjusted the rifle scope toward the first drone tracking its movement, every instinct screaming that a misstep could be fatal. A shout from the radio alerted her to a potential breach at the far end of the base. She pivoted instinctively, spotting another group attempting to slip through a service entrance. She fired again, the rifle steady and controlled, each shot precise, a rhythm forming in the chaos. A strange harmony in the madness around her. She could feel the presence of a figure watching from the shadows, someone she could not see clearly, but whose intent was unmistakable. A cold certainty that this was a trap set to test her, and she realized she would have to face them soon. The base was no longer safe, every corner a potential threat, every shadow hiding danger, and she felt the weight of responsibility crushing her. Yet it fueled her determination. She moved toward the center of the base, coordinating movements with the remaining soldiers, signaling directions to take cover to protect vulnerable points. Her mind was racing, thinking several steps ahead, trying to predict the enemy's next move. She felt the rifle recoil slightly as she fired warning shots to dissuade the advancing figures. Her pulse thrummed in her ears, the sand whipping around her, creating illusions of movement that made her second-guess herself. Every step forward, a battle between instinct and fear. And she knew the moment of direct confrontation was coming closer with each heartbeat. A final figure emerged from behind a stack of crates, this one different, moving with unnatural calm, a presence that made the hair on her neck stand up. She raised, her rifle aiming carefully, tracking its movements, trying to anticipate intentions. It did not make a sound, and she could not see the face, but she felt its eyes on her, piercing through the distance, and she realized that the next move would decide everything. And in that instant, the desert seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. Elena froze, her eyes locked on the figure emerging from behind the crates, the wind whipping through the base, carrying the scent of sand and gunmetal. She could feel the tension coiling in her muscles, every nerve alert and alive. The soldiers around her were scattered, moving with cautious precision, but none dared approach the shadow that moved with unnerving calm. It was larger than she expected. Its steps, deliberate and measured, and every instinct screamed that this was no ordinary opponent. She tightened her grip on the rifle, the stock pressed firmly against her shoulder, her finger brushing the trigger as her mind raced, calculating every angle, every possible threat. The desert seemed to hold its breath around them, the sun climbing higher, casting long shadows across the base and exaggerating every movement. She adjusted her aim slowly, taking in the figure, every detail she could see. Its posture trained its precision, and she realized that whoever it was had been watching the base for a long time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The sound of distant footsteps drew her attention, a group attempting to flank the perimeter. But her focus remained on the figure in front of her. Her pulse thrummed like a drum in her ears, each beat syncing with the rhythm of her breathing. The chaos around her faded in a tunnel vision of survival and instinct. She felt her late husband's presence beside her in memory, guiding her, reminding her of every lesson, every mission, every decision made under pressure. She could almost hear his voice telling her to stay calm, to trust herself, to strike with purpose. The figure suddenly shifted, moving with a speed that made her flinch. It was closer than she had anticipated, a sudden gust of wind carrying the fine grains of sand into her eyes, momentarily blinding her. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear her vision, and when she looked again, the figure had vanished only for a heartbeat before reappearing at a different angle. Her heart raced. She adjusted the scope, tracking the movement, calculating the trajectory, predicting the next step. She squeezed the trigger, but the shot rang only, into emptiness. The figure was gone again, disappearing into the shadows of the base. The young soldiers were yelling directions, trying to coordinate their positions, but their voices were drowned out by the pounding of her own heart, the adrenaline coursing through her veins, giving her strength she did not know she possessed. A sudden shout drew her attention to the far side of the base, a soldier under fire from another hidden assailant. She pivoted quickly, her rifle raising instinctively. She fired 2 quick shots, neutralizing the threat, but it was only a fraction of the problem. The original figure was still out there, a ghost moving through the chaos, testing her patience, testing her skills. She advanced cautiously, stepping over debris, ducking behind crates, using every cover available, her mind calculating escape routes, backup positions, weak points in the enemy approach, every movement precise and deliberate as if she were a part of the base itself. The wind shifted again. Carrying a strange metallic sound to her ears, the figure was approaching from above. A drone had returned, scanning the area with precision. She raised her rifle and fired a warning shot toward the drone, causing it to tilt erratically before retreating. Out of range, she exhaled sharply, but there was no relief. The hidden figure used the distraction to move closer, slipping through the shadows with unnatural speed. She ducked behind a supply container, heart hammering in her chest. She could hear its presence like a predator stalking its prey, a calculated tension that made every hair on her body stand on end. She adjusted her grip on the rifle finger, tightening against the trigger, feeling the recoil anticipation building, a movement to her. Left made her pivot just in time to see the figure attempt to flank her position. She fired a precise shot hitting the target, but when she moved to assess it, the figure was gone. The desert had swallowed it like smoke into the wind. The young soldiers looked at her in awe and fear, inspired by her composure, yet unaware of the invisible threat that still haunted the perimeter. She signaled to regroup, moving silently toward the center of the base, her boots barely making sound against the concrete. The sand swirling around her like a warning, she could feel every heartbeat echoing in her ears, every breath a reminder of how fragile the line between life and death was in this moment. She moved along the edge of the supply yard, ducking low, keeping her vision sharp, scanning every shadow. She could see her reflection in the polished metal of a crate for a moment, catching her own wide eyes and tense posture. And then she focused again on the figure. She could feel it moving just out of sight. Like a phantom testing her resolve, she raised the rifle to shoulder height and moved closer, using every ounce of training she had absorbed over years of missions, her hands steady her breathing. Controlled her mind, calculating every possible movement. The shadows of the base stretched like fingers, reaching for her every corner, a potential trap, every echo, a possible warning. Suddenly, a loud crash erupted behind her, a supply container overturned, hitting the ground with a resounding clang. She spun instinctively, but there was nothing to be seen. Only the scattered sand and empty crates the figure was toying with, her testing her patience, her focus. She moved forward cautiously, each step measured, silent, calculating the distance to cover the angle of approach. The wind carrying the faintest sound of movement, sand shifting under unseen feet. Her pulse quickened. The air felt heavier, every breath. A challenge, the silence around her now thick. With anticipation, she could sense that the confrontation was inevitable, that soon she would face the figure directly, and every decision she had made until now had led to this point. The soldiers were regrouping, following her lead, their movements. More confident, inspired by her resolve, yet still unaware of the hidden enemy weaving through the chaos, she signaled for cover positions, assigning points of observation while keeping her eyes locked on the perimeter. The figure was closer now. Each movement, deliberate watching, testing, analyzing. She could feel a mental game being played, a silent challenge, and she readied herself, anticipating the first direct encounter. She moved behind a large crate, adjusting her scope, calculating the trajectory, and the distance, the angles shifting constantly as the figure approached each step, precise, deliberate, measured to intimidate, to unsettle, to provoke a reaction. Her finger tensed against the trigger. She could feel the heat of the desert sun on her, back the sand, stinging her exposed skin. She raised the rifle, keeping her body low, crouched, ready to fire at the slightest movement. She sensed the figure pause a few meters away, waiting, calculating, watching her as she watched it. Time seemed suspended. The desert holding its breath, waiting for the next move. She could feel the weight of every second pressing against her chest, and then the figure shifted again, moving faster than she anticipated, a blur of motion, and she realized that this was the moment of direct confrontation, the calm before the storm, the instant where training and instinct collided, and she knew that everything was about to change. She rose slightly to gain a better view. The rifle steady, her eyes locked on the figure. It raised its head, revealing just a hint of a face hidden under shadows, yet the intent was clear, the challenge unmistakable, a deadly game unfolding in the desert morning. The young soldiers froze, watching in awe as she steadied her aim. A single shot, a single move could alter the outcome, the tension in the air thick enough to choke on every muscle, coiled every nerve alive, and Elena knew that this was the defining moment of the engagement, and in that instant, everything seemed to slow. Down the wind, the sand, the distant hum of generators, the pounding of her heart, all merging into one pulse that echoed through her body, signaling that the confrontation was inevitable, and that what came next would decide the fate of everyone at the base. Elena felt the heat of the desert sun pressing down on her back, the rifle still firm in her hands, the sand shifting beneath her boots, the wind carrying fine particles into her eyes, stinging them slightly, but she ignored the discomfort, focusing solely on the hidden figure in front of her, the soldiers around her moving cautiously following her lead. Every sense alert to the slightest sound, the distant hum of machinery, and the faint shifting of sand the base stretched out before them, seemingly calm, but Elena knew the danger had only just been fully revealed. In the last moments she had seen the precision, skill, and training of the enemy, and she knew this confrontation could determine the survival of everyone under her protection. The figure lay on the sand, briefly recovering from the controlled shots she had fired. The movements deliberate and calculated, signaling respect for the skill they had just faced. Elena advanced slowly, keeping the rifle level tracking. Every subtle twitch, every shift of weight, every minor movement, her eyes narrowed, trying to read intent, instinct, honed over years of missions, every muscle coiled, ready to react. The young soldiers watched silently, inspired yet fearful, unsure if the danger had truly ended, but their trust in Elena was undeniable, and she felt the heavy weight of that responsibility pressing against her chest. She knew one wrong step could reignite the chaos, and all the training and preparation would be tested once more. Sand swirled around her boots as she moved closer. Every grain, a reminder of the harsh, unforgiving environment they were in. Every shadow, a potential threat. She felt the figure rise slowly, the movement careful, controlled, not aggressive. Not threatening, but still deliberate, a silent acknowledgement of the skill Elena had displayed, and a warning that though the confrontation had ended for now, the danger in this desert was never truly gone. She adjusted her stance, lowering slightly, crouching behind a nearby crate, keeping the rifle ready, her eyes scanning every angle, calculating trajectory and distance, anticipating sudden action. The soldiers began to spread out, securing the perimeter, following her example, inspired by her. Composure, each movement deliberate, careful, ensuring that no one could exploit any gap in their defense. The figure now stood fully visible, the face still partially shadowed, yet unmistakably trained and disciplined. Elena could sense a mixture of respect and acknowledgement emanating from the presence she had faced. No words passed, only unspoken communication, a deadly mutual understanding forged in the heat of battle. She exhaled slowly, trying to calm the rapid beating of her heart. The desert seemed to pause around them, the wind carrying silence, as if acknowledging the tension that had just passed. Elena advanced cautiously toward the figure, maintaining cover, adjusting the rifle, keeping one eye on every potential movement. The figure mirrored her actions, stepping lightly, testing patience, testing resolve, a mental game as much as a physical confrontation. Every glance, every shift, a silent question, testing her skill, her calm, her precision. She could feel the pulse of the desert. Around them, the sand and wind amplifying the sense of anticipation. Every heartbeat a reminder of how quickly the situation could turn deadly again. The young soldiers behind her remained alert, trusting her instincts and example, their fear replaced. With cautious confidence inspired by her focus and discipline. Suddenly, the figure moved forward, a slight feint to the left, attempting to test her reaction time. Elena reacted instantly, pivoting the rifle, tracking the movement, squeezing the trigger. With precision, sending a controlled shot that grazed the arm of the figure, staggering slightly but not falling. She advanced again, using crates, barrels, and debris for cover, sliding low, calculating distance angles, trajectory. With every step, the desert seemed alive around them. Every shadow shifting, every gust of wind, carrying the possibility of a hidden threat. She could sense the tension in the figure. Every motion deliberate testing, patience, testing skill. And she matched it step 4. Step refusing to give ground, a sudden crash echoed from a nearby supply container. The soldiers flinched, but Elena did not. She moved with the fluidity of years of experience, pivoting, adjusting aim, maintaining perfect composure. The figure lunged. Again attempting to flank her, she fired rapid, precise shots, each one calculated to slow and disorient, not to kill, the acknowledgement of skill passing silently between them. The desert wind carried the dust into her eyes, forcing her to blink, but she maintained focus. Every movement, controlled every breath, steady every heartbeat, synchronized with the rhythm of the confrontation. She could feel the pulse of the soldiers behind her, mirroring her composure, gaining confidence as they saw her. Skill under pressure. The figure faltered slightly, signaling respect and recognition of her precision and control. Elena pressed forward, using the opportunity to close distance, carefully low to the ground, keeping the rifle aimed, tracking every motion. The desert seemed to stretch endlessly around them, shadows lengthening, sand swirling in slow, hypnotic patterns, as if the land itself were watching the battle between predator and predator, testing both patience and resolve. She could feel the figure shift, subtly waiting, calculating her reactions, and she mirrored every move with exacting precision, the tension thickening like the weight of the sun pressing down on her shoulders. Finally, the figure raised their hands slightly, acknowledging the confrontation was over. The skill displayed had earned respect, a silent truce formed in the desert between trained predator and survivor. Elena lowered the rifle just slightly, keeping one hand ready, but allowing the tension to ease the soldiers. Moved forward cautiously, securing the perimeter, following her example, inspired by her composure and discipline. The desert seemed to exhale, the sand settling, the wind slowing the early morning calm. Returning gradually, the figure stood silently. Observing the aftermath, the deadly engagement concluded for now, yet the lessons lingered in Elena's mind about patience, skill, focus, and control under pressure. She turned to look at the young soldiers, their eyes wide but full of trust and recognition. Of her leadership, they had survived the test alongside her, guided by instinct, training, and courage. She felt the weight of responsibility slowly ease, leaving a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. The desert stretched endlessly around them, calm, and still carrying the scent of sand, metal, and heat. She adjusted the rifle on her shoulder, scanning the perimeter one last time before allowing herself to breathe fully, the wind shifting lightly across.